topic of this session is policies at the federal, state, and local levels needed to sustain diverse and vibrant schools and communities. Very briefly, I'll introduce the panel. So we're going to lead off with Lynn Kagan, who's a professor for early childhood education here at TC at EPSA, Education Policy and Social Analysis, and works broadly with government in the US and other countries on issues, particularly as they relate to early childhood. Paul Scully to my right, whose background and emphasis is on community organizing around many of the issues we've been talking about, and who serves as the executive director, is that your title, with Building One America, and is organized both in the Midwest and around this region, New Jersey, Connecticut, and the like. And immediately to my left, Tom Rogers, who's superintendent and chief executive officer of the Nassau Boards of Cooperative Education Services, which famously, for those of you who were here this morning, serves those 56 districts and 220,000 students, and he'll be able to tell us how he does that. I mean, he's an umbrella organization that rides over all those separate organizations. I'm going to cut it at that and turn things right over to Lynn.
In the name of full disclosure, I have 3 quickies. Number 1, I'd like to acknowledge Emily Fox. Emily, where are you? You're in this room somewhere. Thank you for helping me with this presentation. Number 2, I would like to acknowledge the presence of my very special early childhood graduate students who teach me more than I teach them, I'm sure. And number 3, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that I came to early childhood through the Head Start door as a civil rights activist and as the daughter of civil rights activists. So my passions for early childhood are definitely a byproduct of my commitment to the equity issues that I'm going to be speaking about today. How many of you think you know about early childhood education in America? You can, yeah, raise your hand, students, please. Okay, all right, okay, all right. Well, let's see if the 3 things I'm going to talk about today spike any interests or anything new. I want to advance 3 hypotheses. The first is that today's early childhood policies, and indeed many government policies, live inside the history of our government, inside the history of our country. Number 2, I'd like to suggest that the inequities that exist in early childhood and in K-12 education are persistent, durable, hard to change. And number 3, I would like to suggest that we do have some really viable action steps that we can take to redress the situation that we're in. Let me begin with early childhood quickly. The perhaps most important value that makes America very different from other countries is our incredible commitment to our independence. We were born with people who wanted to escape the tyranny of monarchies and the tyranny of governments, and who were very, very committed to a small government, a hands-off government. They were also committed to the privacy and the primacy of the family life. For early childhood policies, this means that government intervened in the time of national crises. After World War I, we had a major child care policy in this country never to be seen again. After World War II, the same thing happened. Those policies were initiated, they were disbanded because the social crisis ended. Early childhood sits in service to broader social crises. To who? We serve families who fail. Early childhood, unlike K-12, is not a universal service. It is, by and large, means tested. We therefore have a hands-off, episodic stance to what our government does for young children. We have need-based commitments only. There is no sustained infrastructure to support early childhood education, and indeed I would say that we are a breeding ground for the inequities and the inconsistencies that arrive at the schoolhouse doors at kindergarten. Value 2, localism. Indeed, this country has been predicated on the importance of citizen engagement and of individuals having a voice. This isn't always manifest, but this is the design. Early childhood education is a lot like that. think of us, and this is a quote, as a million little micro enterprises, all very local in organization. Others have characterized early childhood as the Wild West, where nothing is predictable, true, nothing is consistent, and that's true too. Therefore, what we have got in early childhood is a tremendous amount of incongruity, inconsistency. Indeed, early childhood has been described as America's social elephant. You know what I mean? You touch it here and you get a trunk, you touch it there and you get a tail, etc. Third value, entrepreneurialism. Many of our forefathers came here because they were enticed by the promises of streets paved with gold. We have in this country an ethic that hard work will get you anywhere. Now, we all know that's not necessarily true, but indeed, these are the predominant values. This has led, in the absence of a government commitment and a government intervention only when families fail, to an early childhood non-system that is in the market. We tend to talk about federal policies, and we think of our big programs like Head Start and pre-K, but the reality is that the majority of young children who are served in America are served in a market economy by private providers who are very, very interested in earning a living. Early childhood, then, is not a part of our Constitution. It's not a reserved authority for the states. It is not called for anywhere. In fact, still today in parts of this country, the call for public support of early childhood is vehemently rejected as the state intervening, as America communizing its children. It is not legitimated. It is on the agenda today the way it is because early childhood advocates have done just that. We've advocated hard. And indeed, I want to make this last point, it is not anything like K-12 education. It is market-based, it is fee-for-service-based, as opposed to K-12 education that is rights-driven and a universally promise. The governance, there is no governance entity in early childhood. We've got a few emerging in states, but indeed in K-12 education, we have state boards in every state but one. We have local boards which organize the infrastructure and provide planning services for children. Finance, early childhood education at a minimum, publicly financed, is funded by 72 different programs at the federal level, not to mention cascades at the state level. Indeed, there is no guarantee in K-12 education, we have a guaranteed tax base. Not adequate, but at least consistent. You know it's going to be there when you wake up. Certification for teachers, pre-K, inconsistent. Some states, all you have to do is be 17 and breathing. K-12 BAs are required. Regulation, indeed, the regulations vary from state to state in early childhood, some states have very, very limited regulations, and indeed, accreditation is required when we're talking about K-12 education. So don't think schools, think about purchase of service, market economy when you're thinking about early childhood. Okay, part two. What are the legacies this has left us with? And I'm only going to talk really about four. The first is there are total inequities in who does and does not get into early childhood. The second issue is once kids are in these programs, how are they grouped and what are the equities and inequities associated with that? Third, once they're in, who indeed does get quality and who doesn't? And fourth, what are the things that perpetuate all of these inequalities? Okay, who gets in? Far from everybody. Only about half, 54%, of 3- and 4-year-old children are not enrolled in preschools. And if you look at who those children are, indeed you can see that they make up a big mix, but the bottom line, Hispanic, 63% is the most under-enrolled. So of the 54% who are not enrolled, 63% of those are indeed Hispanic. The point here is that access is very limited by race. It is also limited by income. This figure shows that for 3- and 4-year-old children, the higher the income, the more likely they are to be enrolled in early childhood services. We also understand that there are inconsistencies by neighborhood. Rich neighborhoods have more services are offered than poor neighborhoods, and consequently, more children are enrolled. Indeed, you may find this interesting. Access varies by geographic region. In the Northeast, we have the greatest enrollments. Look at the South for a minute. 38% kids are enrolled at 3, 71% at 4. Anybody know why that jump is so high? Anybody guess? We make more money on 4-year-olds. The largest percentage of for-profit programs for 4-year-olds are in the Southeast because the regulations are the lowest, thereby enabling the greatest amount of money to be made. Ergo, the profit-driven motive of this field. To the point that many of us are concerned about in this room and we are here for, that indeed income segregation reigns in early childhood education. Indeed, limited funding means that programs around the country, even if they're called universal, really are not. They tend to begin with needs-based services for needs-based children. Universal pre-K, that we're hearing a lot about, particularly in New York, is ameliorating some of that, but certainly not all of it. Indeed, income segregation reigns dramatically, and this is despite an abundance of literature, some of it conducted right here, that really attests to the liabilities of segregated services and the benefits of income-integrated services for very, very young children. There are citations, and I'm happy to share them with all of you. Now, on to quality. What about this issue of quality? Everybody knows that the only reason to invest in early childhood programs is to get good results for kids. We hear that all the time. The little secret is that those results only accrue when the programs are high quality. But guess what happens? Across the board, the vast majority of programs for all children are of only mediocre quality. In fact, only 4 states meet the standard of the field, which is 10 benchmarks advanced by NEAR, the National Institute for Early Childhood Research. Roughly 42% of children in the United States are enrolled in programs that meet half of these quality benchmarks. Indeed, the other side of the story is that low SES programs, this is despite our efforts with Head Start, despite monies invested by the Child Care and Development Block Grant, low-income kids actually tend to get lower quality programs. They experience larger class sizes. They experience much less outreach to effective transitions to schools. The teachers have less training. They are less well compensated. And indeed, they are less stable. The results of the ubiquitousness of low-quality programs for our poorest children defies the literature. It defies our social intent. Indeed, it denies children the opportunities that early childhood is being sold on and purports to render. Why does this happen? It happens because we've got profound structural inequities, and this is the point I want to make. It's hard to change because these are not just superficial things. Federal funding is very, very inconsistent in its amount and in its duration for young children. You may not be aware of this, but Head Start per capita funding varies annually. It varies from state to state. It's not just a straight per capita formula. So a child in Mississippi is worth less than a child in Maine. Indeed, state revenues that come from sources vary in amount and duration as well. Please note that pre-K programs are becoming much more ubiquitous, and we are spending about $14,000 a child on a pre-K program in New Jersey. However, we've got pre-K programs where about $1,000 is expended. We've got many states where there is no state contribution to services for very young children. So we've got tremendous inequities and fluctuations in the financing mechanisms, making it hard to recruit, hard to plan for the future, hard to know how many children we're going to be able to serve tomorrow. Our accountability mechanisms are equally fraught. Suffice it to say that no state in this country has an adequate data system that incorporates information on all children from birth right all the way through grade 12. We are working on common identifiers in a limited number of states. There is federal money, we're very pleased about this, that has been procured to advance the development of accountability mechanisms and data systems. But right now, we don't have it. So if you want to track, if you want to understand the inequities, you do that based typically on very small scale studies that tend to be isolated state by state. We have very bad generalizable data. In fact, our data systems are worse than Ghana, many countries in Africa, and Latin America with whom I have worked. Governance inconsistencies, I mentioned this before. Every state has a state board of education except for one. We have very few state coordinating mechanisms for early childhood. We've got a lot of councils, a lot of advisory committees, a lot of noise about citizen engagement, but where the rubber meets the road, entities that have authority and accountability simply do not exist in a consolidated way for early childhood. Fine. Bottom line. Deeply, deeply embedded in our national values, we have framed early childhood policies, and that has left us a legacy of chaotic, think the Wild West, uneven, think the elephant, inequitable non-system of early learning in this country. The second bottom line, which is equally important, is that we have reinforced those values by a set of non-existent structures that indeed breed perpetual inequity. And the third bottom line is that given the combination of these values plus the bedrock structures, we have got inequities that are perpetuated when children are very, very young, institutionally perpetuated when they're very, very young, that are extremely, extremely difficult to eradicate. Okay, what are some strategies that you can use in a market-driven setup? Here we go. The first is you got to be really clear on the context, that early childhood exists in a very broad market. Most programs that are serving young children are not amenable to public policies and to public regulation. We also need to understand that early childhood is structurally and fiscally very constrained. The second thing we need to do is we need to be clear on our goals. It's got to be quality, because if you don't have quality programs, there's no point in having kids enrolled. It is only the quality programs that produce the results, and we've got to do so in a way that encourages SES integration. We've got to get very, very clear on our strategies, and I'd like to suggest very quickly two different types. The first are fiscal strategies that would incentivize SES integration, and there are a lot of ways to do this. At the state level, some states are incorporating 3- and 4-year-olds into their school funding formula, which by dint of doing that makes the services universal. Now granted, children may end up in settings that are segregated, but indeed that is at least creating access to everybody. Second, at the federal level, in each and every one of the federal funding streams, we could invert positions that would make these services much more amenable to integrated settings. CCDBG, the Child Care and Development Block Grant, could indeed induce higher rates of reimbursement for those programs in the market that make a commitment to SES integration. Head Start has 10% set aside for children of different incomes. It is never, I don't want to say never, very, very rarely used. It could be incentivized to have that be used so that Head Start programs could become more integrated socioeconomically. At the corporate level, we've got corporations that are funding all kinds of programs, workspace-based programs. Indeed, more of that should be done because it gets us out of the bind of having children go to preschool in their own neighborhoods. They can go at workplace, which can be more convenient for parents and can lead to much more depthful SES integration. Finally, there are major programmatic strategies that need to be considered as well, and these are all policy amenable. First, the teacher preparation and development should really include how you deal with very, very diverse populations. Indeed, early childhood tries not to homogenize its pedagogy, but when push comes to shove, much of it is like K-12 education. We don't spend enough adhering to children's individual differences. Second, I don't think people in America are really well aware about the harm that segregated settings can have on very, very young children. We've got an embryonic research base. This needs to be popularized. And the fourth recommendation says we need to set up more protocols that indeed advance us in this area. Finally, as we are doing here today, and I want to thank Amy and Roush for enabling us to do this, we really need to showcase really good programs that exist in mixed neighborhoods where we see children making wonderful advances. There are some, they are limited, they need to be heightened in the population that they reach, and they need to be popularized as well. I want to thank you for your attention and turn it back to Jeff.
I got one slide. Well, maybe two, but we'll see. And can you read that? All right. I was thinking about, I've been reading The Little Prince to my grandkids. Everybody read that to their kids? Remember how it starts out? Of course. Well, everybody's read it. Remember how it starts out where he draws a picture? He's talking about a picture he drew and he showed it to the grown-ups and they said, well, that's a hat. And he said, silly grown-ups, that's a snake, that's a boa constrictor who ate an elephant. No? Yeah, okay. So what does that look like?
Tornado.
A tornado, really? Huh? Anybody know what it is? Want to guess what it is? I guess it kind of says so on top. Rev's cap, curve. Yeah. Looks kind of like a crater, doesn't it? Like, huh?
Sinkhole.
A sinkhole, yeah, it's like a sinkhole. That's what it is. It is the sinkhole of school funding. So what that actually is, that's the per pupil school funding. That's how school funding worked in New Jersey before the 2008 School Funding Reform Act that went through in that year. So I want to talk. I'm going to talk about policy, federal and state policy, but I want to talk a little bit about politics. And if did I start this thing out? I got my timer here. And then, I don't know, sorry, start. There it goes. Then if I have a little bit of time, I'll talk more about policy. But in our work as community organizers, we think it's critical to understand what's politically feasible and doable and possible before we start thinking about what it is we can do. And the politics help to inform what it is people want as well. So, I heard Myron's talk earlier, and I told him before I would slightly contradict you, but I know I'm not really contradicting him in that we talk about city-suburban coalitions a lot, but I would, at this point in my work, start to say, it's not just about building city-suburban coalitions, that there is something about what's going on in the suburbs today, and the demographic changes, and the fiscal stress in the suburbs, and the political volatility of those places that make them in some ways more important and more critical or places for us to be digging into and organizing and understanding. So we call it the winning politics of inclusion. And it's not the rightness or correctness of policies or the failure of bad policies, but the success of good policies that are politically sustainable and can be defended by majority, what we would call pro-diversity coalitions. So this is an example of what I would say is losing policy and bad politics. So what this really shows, and you see a sampling of the towns, or school district, there's actually 600 plus school districts in the state of New Jersey. So you're only seeing a handful of them. And what it shows is the school funding capacity. This is taking all, and Myron helped us put this data together, taking all of the property tax capacity of every one of these school districts, plus any state and federal aid, and dividing it by the number of students in those school districts. So what you see on my left, right, on your right, on that end, you see that spike way up there? Those are, what do you think? Those are the wealthiest, most powerful towns. There's about 100 really powerful, wealthy, almost all white suburban school districts over there. And they got a couple hundred, what do they got? I don't know, they got about 100,000 kids. And then they average between $20,000 and $25,000 per student. Some of them are obscene, the amount of money that they have. Some of them have very few kids, and they actually have endowments for the money that they're taking in from property taxes. And some of them were actually getting state aid because of the way the formula had nothing to do with need or characteristics. Now, on the other end, you see it spikes up on the other side. Anybody know what that is? People know New Jersey, right? Yeah, but just knowing what you know about the Abbott districts, that's right. Those are the Abbott districts. Those are the districts, those are the poorest districts. Those are about the 31 extremely poor, distressed, mostly black and brown segregated districts. And they're getting a little bit less, maybe between $15,000 and $20,000 per student. That's the Camdens, the Trentons, the Asbury Parks around the state that are that are very, very distressed, very poor, and because of the two Abbott rulings and the way the legislature said we got to find the most cynical way of remedying this that's totally politically unsustainable, we'll do it like this. We'll take all the money and give it to these poor districts, and because of our reliance on property taxes, it will make the wealthy towns the other big winners. Now you have 400 school districts in the middle, plus at least 400 school districts in the middle that fall under $15,000 per student. You have 200 that fall under $10,000 per student. Now, what do you think those school districts look like? Those ones that are falling further and further under. Those are actually the further down you go, that big swath in the middle, those are the Neptunes, those are the West Oranges, those are the Bloomfields, those are the Gloucester Township. These are what? These are the ones we've been talking about. These are the ones that are increasingly diverse. They are not generally some of them are. There's some of the, what were they referred to before as the Coalition for Association, what's the coalition referred to of diverse schools of, yeah, some of those towns like Maplewood, South Orange, Montclair, but most of them are not towns that have that kind of wealth in them. They're very flat, middle-class, working-class communities that people are still moving to out of Philadelphia, Camden, Newark, looking for opportunity. And these are places, so those towns that are falling under, how do they make up the shortfall? They have the highest property taxes of anybody in the state. And you hear about the property taxes in places like New Jersey. So what does this say? This says essentially the current policies, at the time at least, and this is similar in different ways to a lot of other states, except in some places you might not have the spike on the other end, although there's people trying to make that happen in a lot of places. That we are, in a sense, we have a set of policies that essentially reward the most segregated. They're rewarding extreme wealth segregation on one end and basically telling the rest of the school districts, well, if you become a total basket case, you might get some help. It's not going to really help the kids, but you'll get some extra money. But if you're in the middle and you're grappling with a diverse, middle-class, working-class, racially changing, demographically changing, and challenged school district, you're screwed. As a matter of fact, everything's going to work against you. Your taxes will go up, you'll have more challenges in your schools, and all the other problems that come with this kind of dramatic racial and economic change that's been happening all over the state. So the program that we responded to this with was a school funding formula that essentially would fill in that gap. And it was opposed by the people on my left over there, because some of them were getting state aid. They wanted to keep getting state aid. And it was opposed by the people on my right, because they said, well, we might not get as much money in the future, plus this could mean the end of Abbott as we know it. Which it was, because Abbott was one of the most unpopular and fiscally and politically untenable systems you could possibly imagine. It was tremendously resented by those diverse middle-class, working-class communities. Now, one other aspect of those places in the middle, they control the state legislature. You look at how the state legislature swings, it doesn't swing on those two ends, it swings in the middle. So the speaker, who may have represented parts of Camden, he needed his caucus from those other places to get anything done. And so we were able to put together a pretty powerful coalition to actually get this school funding reform bill passed. It wasn't exactly how we wanted it, but it was pretty good. Myron helped put it together. We did maps. We had testimony. We had a state senator, John Adler, who died recently, became a congressman. He was the head of a committee that came up with this formula. It was simply said that school funding should be based on its district's ability to pay and the demographic characteristics of the school district. And so it didn't say, rather than saying you had to become a complete basket case to, where are we, this thing went up? To, about 2 minutes? Okay. To get money, you got money based on any number of low-income kids that came into your school district. So it actually incentivized diversity. And it actually, there was a lot of communities that were suffering from high property taxes. After this was passed, that we actually can stabilize and even lower some of the property taxes in some of these communities that were having to raise property taxes or trade off property tax raises for the schools for something else that they needed to do for the municipality. And it helped to build and solidify a very powerful coalition. I think one of the most important aspects of building and solidifying this coalition, it was the same coalition. As a matter of fact, could you change the slide? There is one other slide. It's not, yeah. That's the, Myron also helped do this map, or he did this map, but it was based on the RCA data that Zav was talking about. You know, again, this was the same coalition that defeated that loophole that allowed wealthy towns to pay poor towns to take their low-income housing. And it was the same communities in the middle that were not benefiting at all by this, that were able to defeat it. So what I want to make this point, and I want to get into a couple of these policy points, is that this was not done under the radar screen. This was done in a very overt, open, loud campaign. And the issues of race were not obscured. As a matter of fact, the issues of race were right out front. Now, you know, Sonia Sotomayor said in her ruling that, you know, responding to Judge Roberts, if you want to do something about racial inequities, you have to speak about race openly and overtly. That's what we believe, and that's what we have found to be the case, because race is a very powerful weapon. It's a very powerful force in America, and if we cede it to the enemy, it will be used by them. And it's something people are talking about anyway. It doesn't mean you just go around blabbing about it. It means you have to have the right way of talking about it, so you're not alienating if you alienate three-quarters of the people in the room, most of the white people, then you've already lost politically. If you alienate one quarter, right, and form common cause with everybody else about building multiracial, that's my alarm, diverse communities, then you actually can win. And when you actually accusing the other side of continuing to support systems that reinforce Jim Crow, then you've actually got race as a powerful weapon, except that it's on the side of the majority, not on the side, not against the majority. Follow me? All right. So we actually think that there's a really powerful moment today to begin to address these issues and schools, you know, it's not the only thing we work on, but schools are probably, in some ways, it's like the canary in the coal mine. These are the places that are changing more rapidly, and we find, you know, it's hard to get sometimes mayors, they got their head in the sand, but school superintendents know this more than anybody else. You know, they know it sooner, and they're far more aware of it, but they're also very aware of the politics. When we were talking to Jefferson County superintendent in Colorado, she said, we have a problem with segregation in our schools, but I also want to remain superintendent. Help me deal with that, right? That's the challenge. All right, I'm going to give like 5 points, right? All right, policies. So winning policies that support and incentivize diversity, inclusion, and integration. States can do this and the federal government can do this, but we have to build coalitions with these leaders and superintendents and chambers that are to fight this fight. One, we can start by recognizing these communities and their challenges and not looking down their noses at them and say things like these are just white suburban moms. Right? You know, the comment that the Secretary of Education made, which he may say was a slip, but it's very indicative of the kind of attitude that we see from elites toward, including people in the policy realm, toward these kinds of middle and working class communities that are struggling. It's just acknowledging what they're up against will go a long way. 2, stop making their work harder. Do no harm. The thing I hear more than anything else from these folks, superintendents and school leaders, is unfunded mandates. The things that are coming from Washington and from states are things that are saying you're more trouble than they're worth. 3, recalibrate. You know, so if you're not going to, you know, start not doing harm, we can maybe start doing some good. Recalibrating funding priorities and policies that measure success and reward and bolster diverse schools by lifting up diversity as an asset that we value. That means providing more funding for schools because of the racial and economic diversity. Perhaps instead of race to the top, we should have maybe race to racial economic diversity, or maybe just race to look like America, and start rewarding schools that as they get closer to the demographic realities of their regions or the country. 4, fund and help to provide programs that help diverse schools stay diverse and become stably integrated. There's a lot of people in some of those communities that have had a lot of experience with these kinds of programs. You know, some more carrots than just sticks in helping some of these communities. Tie other types of federal and state investment policies like water and sewer and infrastructure and housing to school diversity and school integration. 6, I already touched on this, talk about race. Right? We have to actually address it, and we have to talk about it in a constructive way that actually unifies and builds a powerful majority coalition. Maybe not everybody, but a majority coalition. So I think I'm pretty much out of time. You know, some more thing? No. No, okay, no. Good.
I'm going to go through this presentation with you very quickly because there are a lot of slides, but each slide only has one point. So if you're someone who can absorb data visually, this is going to be crack for you. If you are not someone who can absorb data visually, I'm going to tell you the point of the whole thing right now, and then after you get the point of the whole thing, you can just check out and check Facebook or do World of Warcraft or whatever you're into. So the point of this whole thing is 60 years after Brown, we're really good at deliberate and not so good at speed. Right? In fact, we could even call this presentation 116 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, because what you've seen is we are still separate and we are still unequal. So the point, for those of you who need to check Facebook, of this whole presentation is there are a lot of big ideas, big picture solutions, big reorganizations and restructuring of society ideas that have been floated today. And my point is going to be, yes, and what are we doing in the meantime? And so I'm going to show you a meantime strategy of how to get there. A little bit about me. Yes, I'm a superintendent. How did I get here? Not from the classroom. Weird. I started out as a policy person in the state Senate doing school aid policy for the state of New York. I was 22 years old. I was in charge of $6 billion. Makes sense to you? Makes sense to me. I have a degree in biochemistry. So that of course qualified me for this work. And it should not come as any surprise to you that about 16 years after I started doing that work in the Senate, Michael Rebell sued the state and found my work product to be unconstitutional. Go figure. So that's my history. I left the Senate because I concluded that my job at the Senate was to take a profoundly unfair system and use all of my knowledge and all of my skill to perpetuate it. And that didn't sound like stuff to put on a tombstone. So I left and ultimately ended up running a policy association for superintendents, and from there, Teachers College for a stint of duty, and then ultimately into the work itself. And so very quickly, I'm going to run you through this. So if Long Island were a state, and we've heard a lot about it, it would be a darn good one from the things that people like to count, such as number of blue ribbon schools, school completion rate, number one schools by all these magazine rankings, number of best gold and silver schools by US News. I told you this was going to go fast. Number of Intel scholars. So if Long Island were a state, it would have more Intel semifinalists than every other state. The second state would be the rest of New York, including New York City. Siemens, we'd be number 3 after California and Texas, which have like 9 billion times our population. So that's the great news. It's a great system. There are some things that have been produced well from this segregated system. The bad news is education isn't, the Atlantic just figured this out apparently. American education isn't mediocre, it's deeply unequal. Shocker. So this is from the Roush Foundation, and a lot of this data is cribbed from there. They've done a couple of reports. I take their facts out of order because I'm not a linear thinker, and because I'm basically going to construct an argument. And this is, on one slide, the whole argument. Facebookers, look up for 1 second. Fact, school segregation, US average is the little house on the left. Long Island segregation is the house in the middle. Nassau segregation is the house on the right. So this is the point we've been making all along. Second point is Black and Hispanic students tend to be concentrated in schools that serve high concentrations of students in poverty. And lastly, people may not be so enthusiastic about school merger kinds of ideas, but they don't seem to mind things like magnet schools. So what do you do with that? Well, here's the first point, school segregation. We saw that slide earlier, someone else did it. I thought mine was prettier though. Here's Nassau County. These are census districts overlaid against school districts. And what I'm going to show you, if I can figure out how to use the laser pointer, is look at how sharp some of these lines are between school districts. This is Garden City, this is Hempstead. Tell me you can't feel that line. So when I first got to Nassau County, my office is right there on the border, and as I drove up Clinton Avenue from Hempstead into Garden City, I felt like somebody had turned on a green light because the canopy, the 60-foot canopy of trees suddenly appeared. Very different neighborhoods. But someone said at lunch, you know, I was in the session that talked about real estate agents and steering. And I said, don't tell me that people don't know where the lines are. I'll prove it to you when I show you my slides. This doesn't sound like random assignment to me. So this is the system that we have. It is unequal, but it is changing rapidly. So before we say, we kind of threw up our hands earlier in the day, and a similar slide to this was shown. Oh my gosh, Nassau County, 3 times the national average segregation. This is New York City. Now, I don't know this particular researcher, but he has a handsome website, and his slide makes my point, so I stole it. And his point here is New York City is incredibly segregated. And so I applied the same less than 10% to Nassau County. Let's see what it does. I didn't quite exactly have the data, so it's less than 15% white, but that is the same measure but applied to Nassau County. So do we have pockets of extreme segregation? Yes. Are we more segregated than New York City? No, at least not in terms of extreme segregation. Do we have work to do? Absolutely, but I think context is really important, and the kind of data I like best is counterintuitive data. So that comparison of these last 2 slides, I think would be counterintuitive data to people. And I'm going to share a little more counterintuitive data with you. All right, this was done earlier as well. School poverty, we already know that. This is really important. So for those of you who like charts, along the x-axis is poverty, percentage of kids with free lunch. Along the y-axis, graduation rate. No surprise, you've got this cluster of Nassau County school districts in the upper left-hand corner, low poverty, very high graduation rates. The dotted line is the state average graduation rate. And then you have what I call target districts. I prepared this for the commissioner. I report to the commissioner. Among other people, I report to 56 superintendents. I report to everybody. And no one likes me. So this was prepared for him to show that there are districts in Nassau County that we are focused on because they are higher in poverty and because they typically have lower graduation rates. Most of these districts, though, have graduation rates that are tracking right along with the state average. However, there are some districts that are clearly having graduation rates way below the state average. This is in the 30s. This is Roosevelt, the only state takeover district, just in the low 40s. And then the point of this graph is to say, look, here's Westbury with about the same level of poverty as Roosevelt, and yet their graduation rate is much higher. Something qualitatively different is going on here. Here's Hempstead, and I believe this is Freeport, and they're also roughly at the same point in poverty, and yet they have very different experiences for students there. So concentrations of poverty are problematic, and concentrations of challenge ELL populations, et cetera, are problematic, but they are not dispositive in terms of what can be achieved in a school district. So the next piece of counterintuitive data is you might say, well, there's probably a huge funding disparity between these districts, and this slide is to show you, no, actually that's not true. Now someone earlier today compared Elmont School District to Great Neck in terms of funding. Great Neck is a K-12 district. A high school program is a lot more expensive than an elementary program. Elmont is only an elementary school district. So I would just critique that that's not a fair comparison, but on this slide, the triangles are the K-8 districts. And so you see they tend to be a little bit lower. But the blue ones are K-12 districts, and you look at these target districts, including Hempstead and Roosevelt, the 2 districts that have these dissimilar kinds of rates, and you see that they're getting at the county median in a high spending county. So now there's an argument to be made about, is that enough resources considering the challenges that are brought along by poverty and language learner status? And that's a fair argument to have, and that's an argument Mike Rebell makes very strongly. But it would be wrong to conclude that their underachievement is the result of inadequate resources compared to similar target school districts that are spending what they're spending, and they're spending what the county average spends. So where are these districts that achieve advanced regents diploma? And the red districts have the fewest number of students achieving the advanced regents diploma, and these are, of course, the same target districts from the previous slide. So there's a sense to get an advanced regents diploma, it's not just 5 regents exams, it's 8. It's not about the exams, it is about the exams, but it's also about being in a richer curriculum in order to get there. And so this talks about the depth of educational program that exists somewhere. Back to that slide on the Intel semifinalists that we thumped our chest about with pride. First of all, so many of them come from Long Island that if Long Island were a state, yada, yada. Well, where do they come from in Nassau County, for example? Well, it turns out that 6 districts produce over 100 of the 180 Intel semifinalists over the last 5 years. So we're doing great if you draw the lens around Nassau County, but if you look at individual districts, it's a little spottier. But I will say, all these great districts have handfuls of kids, ones and twos every year. And so people are working on this, but there are some places that really plug a lot of resources into it. So what are the solutions? What are you doing in the meantime while people are working on all deliberate speed? And here's what, on the left-hand side, are there big picture kinds of things that can be done? Absolutely. What can you do in the short term? Our organization, as Jeff said, is an umbrella organization, and we do support and services to schools, but we also run regional schools. And I'm often fond of saying that one of the things I admire most about the organization I lead is that we're the only educational institution in Nassau County that has no internal boundaries. And so what does that allow us to do? We run these 3 regional schools: a career and technical education high school, which is not your dad's VOTEC, if you put that in the back of your mind, a STEM program that was just opened this fall, and a high school for the arts that is a magnet school. And the challenge is the state is underinvesting in these strategies, even though these are the strategies that could be successful, and I'll show you why. And so we've had to rely more and more on philanthropy. So career and technical education, don't think about this kid can't make it in the academic program, we're going to teach him to swing a hammer. 80% of these kids go on to college. Why? Here are the biggest sending districts to this program, ranked by their level of students in poverty, and these are the graduation rates that they achieve in their home school district. These are the kids from those districts at our program. We embed curriculum into what they're doing, and they are more engaged with the work because it's something that they like to do. And what about the ethnicity of Berry Tech versus Nassau County as a whole? So you have an N size of Nassau County. This is high school population, so let's call it somewhere in the neighborhood of 80,000 students. And on the right-hand side, Berry Tech is about 1,300 students, but the N size is certainly statistically significant. And what you can see is that Berry Tech does, in fact, reflect, for the most part, the ethnicity of the county, and we're achieving these really great results with kids from even the most challenged districts, which I showed you on the previous slide. This is the STEM program that we just launched this fall. This is the morning class, there's an afternoon class, and I'll show you where these students are coming from. But we just launched this, obviously, with some external support in a public-private partnership. And the secret sauce in this program is we made partnerships with Cold Spring Harbor Labs and Brookhaven National Labs, and they're enriching this program with lots and lots of their research scientists who want to do this work. Why? Because back to this slide on where the Intel scholars are coming from, you see the clear districts don't have any Intel scholars in the last 5 years. Guess where all the first-year districts to this program came from? All right. I'm going to need about 1.5 more minutes. I'm sorry? We're never going to find out that. Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay. All right. I will look at Jeff for more forbearance, and I will try to, okay, 2 is good. And then second-year school districts, we're talking to some right now. They're going to be more of the districts that don't have any Intel scholars. So we are an opportunity to we are an organization that provides an opportunity to equalize access to high-quality curriculum. So it will not be possible for these districts on their own to create a science research program that could lead to an Intel application, but working with us and then through us to places like Cold Spring Harbor Labs and Brookhaven National Labs, you could. High School for the Arts, same thing, skipping through this. The regents have some ideas, none of it's working because the legislature is ignoring them. And here's what's happened on Long Island, and this is a good place because really we are talking about policy and counterproductive policy, and state policies in the last several years have been counterproductive to this whole goal of today's conversation, because this is the number of classes in a school district that are of greater than 25. So if you care about class size, you care about this slide. This is 2010, this is 2014. The class sizes are all going up, and they're going up faster in low wealth districts than they are in high wealth districts. So you already had a weaker opportunity, and we're making it weaker still with these things that the state is doing, cutting aid. And this is what happened in 11-12. People cut BOCES CTE slots for students, then they cut them again the next year, and they cut them again the year after that. So the opportunities for students to go to these regional magnet programs that do break down the walls of diversity are really being impeded by our state. And so the last thought I'll leave you with is, while we're waiting for deliberate to become speed, I was having a conversation with Bob Jarvis from Penn, who runs an education equity network in Nassau County, among other places, and is involved with the MSAN program that was referred to earlier. While we're working on trying to create solutions to this problem in the short term, the diversity that is being driven by immigration is happening so overwhelmingly fast that may solve the diversity problem before we solve the segregation problem, if I can characterize his conversation. And I would say the data point I would put behind that is Nassau County, 1 in every 4 homes in Nassau County speaks a language other than English in the home, and Spanish is not the dominant language. So thank you very much for your patience and your forbearance.
This questioner says your presentation on what is and is not pre-K excluded the model of pre-K associated with universities such as Hollingsworth at TC and the pre-K program at Barnard, where, I got to say, I know that I don't write anymore. I just type. I think, I've watched people struggling reading these questions. I think we've all become doctors in terms of our handwriting. Where Blue Ivy Carter is admitted and Northwest is waitlisted, how do you explain this model and formula of learning? I don't know if that makes sense to you.
I'm not sure I get the gist of the last part of the question, but let me address the first part. We have got some wonderful, and this is true globally, exemplary early childhood programs, and the ones that are operated at this institution are among them. There are many others, but they constitute a grain, a little teeny grain on a very, very big sandy beach, both in terms of the children who are included and in terms of the range of programs that exist. They are not the run-of-the-mill average program. And in order to gin up quality across the board, particularly for our low-income youngsters, indeed, we've got to take some big, big strides to make the vast majority of programs look like the ones that exist in lab settings.
A question for Tom. Do you feel BOCES has succeeded in Hempstead? What new measures have not yet begun?
Exceeded or succeeded?
Succeeded.
So we serve a lot of students from Hempstead in our program, and we achieve better graduation rates with their students. You saw their graduation rate was very disappointing. There is an ongoing conversation with the state education department about the tension between low performance in school districts and intervention from the state. So I am a state official, but my duties only extend as far as the leash the commissioner gives me. And so they are struggling with their knowledge of, I'm being delicate, as you can tell, which is not my style. My style is to chirp along. So they did take over the Roosevelt School District in Long Island, and that was widely regarded as 2 things. 1, an educational failure, and 2, the thing that ended Commissioner Mills' term of office. And so I think the new administration there recognizes that in the person of Commissioner John King, they have a person of color leading the state education department, and there's an opportunity, but there is also a sober understanding of the limitations of the state education department intervening in individual school districts. But they have done some muscular interventions in Buffalo, and I know that they are watching now to see how those interventions work, including busing students from Buffalo to the BOCES program in Erie County. And I think they're waiting to see what happens with those before they translate them elsewhere.
And one more question for Paul. So New Jersey has a Republican governor and New York has a Democratic governor. As someone who thinks about the politics of this and organizing, does that make a difference?
Yeah, it makes something of a difference. I mean, both those policies that were won in the legislature, this governor has tried to roll both of them back, and that same coalition that came out of those diverse suburbs and organized the legislature, they've been able to hold the line on that, and they're fighting his efforts to dismantle and roll back the education funding formula, and they've they've fought completely his efforts to roll back the fair housing bill. But, you know, I was just at Congressman Lobiando's office. He's a Republican member of Congress. We have 6 moderate Republican members of Congress, and they all represent those kinds of very, very diverse districts. So, you know, there's actually a real opportunity for bipartisanship in working in these places and trying to get something done. I don't know if that answers your question, but Kirsty's a little bit of a different animal, though.
Well, thank you. Can we thank the panel?